Today, and MSNBC. Please give a warm Raizado welcome to Morgan Radford.
Bueno, sí. Camina.
Hello. A ver, mi gente linda, ¿cómo están? Ojalá que estén bien. Muchísimas gracias por estar acá. Bueno, this is such an honor to be here. I'm so excited and happy. If you need to get up, move around, do a praise dance, do whatever you need to do to wake up. We're going to have a little charla about what we just saw. This was a really important conversation, and I think there's something so powerful about bringing these private conversations that happen inside our homes and amongst friends to the public forum. So here to help us do that today, let's go ahead and bring the ladies up to the stage. Julissa Arce, you just saw her there. She is the author of You Sound Like a White Girl. Come on up, Julissa. She's done incredible work talking about... Thank you, Julissa. Have a seat. We also have Janelle Martinez. Janelle, if you want to come on up, we just saw you dropping pearls of wisdom up there. Janelle is a writer and the founder of Latina. Yes, and of course, last but very not least, Monica Ramirez. Monica, our fearless leader. Monica is, of course, our host, but also the co-founder of the Latinx House. Monica, first off, I think we need to just reset and say thank you, because este es un espacio tan especial que has creado, a safe space, I think, to have so many conversations. And you don't have to say, even personally, just going off script, the number of conversations I have and events like this that I attend, this is the first time I've really seen the diversity of Latinidad centered. Not in the periphery, not just, one little charlita, but at the center and braided through the conversations that we've heard all weekend. So, muchísimas gracias. Thank you for creating this space. Let's give Monica a round of applause. So, again, we want to unpack some of what we just saw there on the screen, and if we can, I would like to keep this as an informal conversation. So we'll keep our questions and answers relatively brief so that you can come up and follow up on anything else, but I would love to open this up for just questions from you all. So if we can save a little time to do that, we'll just keep our conversation moving, keep it casual. Again, this is a safe space. I feel like we understand that any questions asked here are with good intention. And I think that's important, right? Things sometimes when we're talking about culture and identity, they can get messy. And I think that's a good thing. And I think it's a healthy thing. And so I want us to feel safe asking all of our questions and supporting each other in the process, okay? Julissa, one of the things I saw that was so interesting is the diversity of experience, right? We heard them say, Justina was saying, if we had a table that was 100 feet long, we still wouldn't cover the diversity of experience. Why do you think that was such an important point to drive home for this audience?
I think that the Latino identity is such a complex, complicated one, right? Because we always have these conversations about, is Latino a race? Should it be a race, at least for purposes of the census, for example? I think the way that we understand race is, you're white, you're black, you're Asian, and then there's not a lot of room in those conversations. Like, where do we fit in, right? Like, I remember all the way back to middle school going to the doctor and having to fill out this form of my race. And it was just white, black, Native American, Asian. There was not even like an other that I could check back then. And so I always had this sort of questions about my own identity, like, where do I fit in? Do I fit in anywhere? And I think that it's really important to understand, as it was said in the previous panel, that where we come from is so different, right? Because even in the US, there are people like myself who are immigrants, and then there are people like some of my friends from Texas whose parents and whose great-great-great-grandparents appear in the first census of Texas when it was a republic, right? And so it's kind of hard to talk about the Latino experience as one experience, because in fact it's not one experience. Some of us are immigrants, some of us are not, some of us are white, some of us are black, some of us are indigenous, and some of us are somewhere, some mixture of all of those things. And so I think it's really important to call out that my particular experience is different than anybody else's experience in this room, and yet what was said at the beginning of the special, I do still very much believe that there is something that connects us all. What that thing is, I don't know, and I don't think that we'll ever be able to quite define it, but I do think that it exists, and there is something that connects us, even if our individual experiences are so different.
And because of that connection, you know, a lot of times in rooms like this, we're sort of preaching to the choir, right? Like we're here because we care about this. We're here because we share some element of this identity. But Monica, was there anything about that conversation that surprised you, that perhaps you did not know before?
I mean, I can't say that I was surprised, because I feel like, you know, I've had the pleasure of knowing most of the people who are at the table, so I feel like we've talked about some of these, you know, issues in other contexts. But for me, one of the things that that really struck me was the conversation that we were having about the altars that we have in our homes, and sort of the way that we gather, and the way that and what religion is meant. And I think the comments that were made earlier are really important for us to hear. And I thought about that a lot, because, you know, I grew up in rural Ohio. I live in rural Ohio, and for us, like, going to church, you know, I don't think it wasn't about the religion. It was about going to a place once a week at 1 o'clock and seeing all the other people who are Latino, where we saw each other, and that was our safe space. And so for me, like, hearing about how in some ways we all identified with that, and still, you know, we're kind of practicing that in our own lives and families, but then also trying to reconcile, like, you know, there's been a lot of harm done through religion and through religious institutions. And so for me, I think that it's important for us to talk about what religion and spirituality have meant. And in my case, it was about having a place in a town where there aren't a lot of people who look like me, and who definitely don't have the same experiences in my family. But at the same time, being cognizant of the fact that while that is true, there's still stuff that we have to confront related to religion. So I'm happy that we brought that up in the conversation, and I think that that's a place that we can continue to build from, to have more conversations about the complexity, that sort of the tension that exists there.
Speaking of that identity, Janelle, one of the things I found really fascinating about that conversation was the talk about Afro-latinidad. It was interesting listening to Gina describe how she felt like she really couldn't be both a la misma vez, right? Do you think progress has been made? Do you feel included?
That's a really interesting, not interesting question. I think it can depend upon the space, right? What I appreciated about many elements of the conversation, but it was an intergenerational conversation, right? So I think what Gina's perspective is not necessarily my own perspective. I'm grateful for the fact that definitely in terms of visibility of this conversation, people actually understanding that there is a term like Afro-Latina or Black diasporan, or however someone chooses to identify. I think the language around that's really important. But something that a few friends of mine often remind me, right? I think we all operate from various levels of privilege, right? In the sense that me being a Black Latina, born, raised, still reside in the Bronx, my lived experience is different than my cousins that live on the coast of Honduras, Garifuna. Access looks very different. And so I think I can sit here and absolutely speak to the progress of visibility, the progress of what we're seeing in media, but how does that translate to Latin America? And that's something that I'm still personally thinking through and working through. I mean, there's, I believe, 134 million Afrodescendientes, right? And the fact that we can go to any country and see Blackness, even at that table, some of the very things that we were commending, cuisine, spirituality, that's Black and Indigenous things, right? And crediting the fact that we are not a monolith, and within that we have to acknowledge the diversity as what has been discussed, but also how is this conversation and many others translating to the impact of people in our respective countries as well. So this is something that I'm still actively thinking about. So I think progress, yes, has been made, but absolutely, this is an invite for more.
And I guess at that point, what can we do, right? Like, these conversations are so powerful and they're so important. But the truth is that every single person in here can go back to wherever they're from, to wherever they're living, and create space, right? Like, when I heard you guys talking about that, I think a lot about language, and I love something that Dr. Moreno said in the last panel about generations. We're going to have to come to terms with the fact that these communities look different, they sound different, the world is changing, right? And how we reclaim space and connection while giving grace, right? I mean, we heard so many people talk about their shame, feeling like they didn't feel comfortable en español, right? I mean, we have to come to terms with many of us are mixed race. Unless we're all, intermarrying and going back to the countries where we came from, we're all going to look different, in a few years, and we're going to have different ways of connecting. Julissa, you wrote this book, You Sound Like a White Girl. What does that mean? What does the language and the power of language and that type of criticism mean for this community?
Well, you sound like a white girl, and it's interesting to me when I go to different places and the title of my book is said. And in some places, people laugh because they get it. In some places, it's just like totally dead quiet, and I know that people are offended in the audience, and I'm like, good, this is the audience. And so it's sort of interesting, sort of the reaction that people have to this title of the book, and I think that the reaction that people have to the title says a lot about their own experiences and where they are on their own journey to decolonization. Right? Because if assimilation is sort of is a word, assimilation, I think decolonization is sort of the antonym to assimilation. And I mean, the title of the book really comes because when I was 14 years old, a boy I had a crush on told me I sounded like a white girl. And I took it as a compliment because at that point in my life, being a recently arrived immigrant from Mexico, I wanted to sound like a white girl. I wanted to get rid of any traces of my accent. I wanted the way that I spoke English to say I am from here. I belong here. Right? And what I ultimately discovered is that however it is that you speak English with an accent or not, when you look like this, people automatically assume that you're a foreigner and that you don't belong in this country. And so much of the book, there's a little bit of my personal experience in the book, but so much of the book is really about our history. And it's about reclaiming that history and learning that history, because many of us have been robbed of truly understanding how deep our roots are in this country and how those roots in our home countries, if you are an immigrant, are the same roots that connect you here. Right? Earlier in the panel, they were talking about like language, right? And why language has been lost, and I can only really speak to sort of like Spanish. And in the United States, when we think about sort of school segregation, we don't often think about sort of Mexicans and how they were segregated in schools, and Puerto Ricans and how they were segregated in schools. But Texas and California, 80% of schools were segregated, and the excuse that was used was English. It would say, you don't speak English, therefore you have to go to this Mexican school. And what courts found is that, in fact, it was somebody's Spanish last name that was the determinant for whether somebody would go to the white school or the Mexican school. Right? And so English was literally beaten out of us. Right? Did I say English? I meant Spanish. Spanish was literally beaten out of us. And so there was a whole generation of people who didn't teach their children how to speak Spanish because they were afraid of how they might be treated. Right? And so all of these things that we're experiencing in our community, all of the internal struggles of wanting to be more white, of wanting to better the race by marrying someone who's lighter skinned than us, all of those things have a root, and they have a historical root. We did not invent these things, although we have taken these ideas and ran with them, right? But sort of understanding the historical roots. And I'm not a historian. I think in another life I would love to have been one. But I'm fascinated by the history of it all. And I think for me, so many of the answers that I have been able to find and so much of the healing that I've been able to do has been through learning our history.
How do you, Monica, Janelle, how do you think that we should handle that, right? And we talk about the history of language and why it's such a personal experience, but how should we handle that hoy en día? How do you hope people handle it with you? And sort of to contextualize my question, I talk to so many people who describe how regional it is, for example, Cuando yo estoy en Miami, olvídate. Like, no one's just talking to me in English off jump. It's just not going to happen. On the West Coast, when I do stories, it always is really fascinating to me how, like, many people begin in English in a way that sort of surprises me. I talk to a lot of Afro-Latinas who say it's really offensive when I'm walking into a store, todo el mundo está hablando español, and then all of a sudden they turn and speak English as if yo no soy Latina.
This happens to me too, by the way.
And right, like, you feel something when that happens, right? Like, and so how do we balance this feeling of being included and also, you know, giving grace to people who are still on their journey, trying to find their way? Like, how do you think and how do you prefer people handle that with you?
So one thing that I really resonate with, and I believe Dr. Marta mentioned it in the last panel, is, you know, sometimes we do have to call, I think I'm paraphrasing, but call it out or call people in terms of, for example, like people not acknowledging your ability to speak the language, etc. I think to also take it back to also what was said in that panel. So for me, growing up, both of my parents are Garifuna. That is the language that I heard being spoken. That is the language that they were speaking to my grandparents. And so when it came to Spanish, oftentimes people would be like, well, how do you have that last name? You don't speak, you know, Spanish. And this is something that I feel is my own work to do, right? I think a lot of me not speaking fluent Spanish or not even speaking fluent Garifuna is solely for the fact that I felt the need to fit into spaces, not alarm people with questions, which is very much so not the case at this point. And I think there is an invite to do the work. I know for me personally, right? So like asking my parents at times, like, yeah, let's, you know, speak to me in Garifuna. Though I do understand a lot, it's more of like the actual, you know, responding in English. And I think that that's a byproduct of not trauma, I don't know if that is the word, but really the fact that in spaces, you know, I walk into spaces, obviously I'm a Black woman, but not feeling like I want to have to play a role, which I think can happen. And I know I went all over with my response, but I do think that it's never too late to relearn, to reclaim, and then also at times when, culturally speaking, someone may approach and like have inappropriate questions or whatever the case may be, to call people out on it, right? I think it's time. I think we've said it enough. It's 2022. There are certain things that I think are you cannot be dismissed, basically, I should say. So.
And just to add on, because I completely agree with all that's been said, I think we have to model it also. You know, I was not taught Spanish growing up because I lived in rural Ohio where my parents expected us to be discriminated against if we spoke it, and so they didn't teach me or my siblings. I actually learned Spanish because, as many of you know, I'm a farm worker, advocate, and activist, so I taught myself all the names of all of the crops and everything that had to do with agriculture, so that I could communicate with the farm workers who I was serving. And that's how I learned Spanish. That was my starting point. And my Spanish isn't great. You know, I mess up all of the time. And I think we have to model being uncomfortable. We have to be open about what we're still working through. We have to have more conversations like this. We have to not shame each other for not speaking perfectly. We have to invite people to speak whatever language they feel most comfortable speaking in. You know, I think we have to approach it at, you know, we have to be open. You know, I think we have to walk into rooms with open hearts. I hope that's how we move in the world all the time, and I think that also relates to language. And, you know, if I mess up a word, I hope that that's okay, and I'm just going to keep on rolling, you know, and I hope that we all do that, because I think then maybe we'll all get more comfortable in a way, like the Spanglish, that is part of who we are too. And so I think so much of what we model in the world is what eventually becomes the norm. And so that's how I hope people approach me about language. And sometimes people speak to me in Spanish, and then for whatever reason in that moment I get really nervous and I decide to speak in English. Or sometimes I might decide that I'm going to start a conversation in Spanish, and however we show up that day and feel, we should all be okay with that and welcome that.
I love that. And I guess before we open it up to questions, what would be your call to action, right, to the people in this room? Because I've heard snippets, right, throughout all the panels of things that are kind of discreet asks, right, that would help people create space for us. Julissa, one of my favorite moments in that was when you said, "Tú los cubanos, bueno, a ti te toca." It's you guys are sometimes part of the issue here when it comes to inclusion, right? I think about my own family. I mean, that's, I think, why it struck me. I think of my own family having a super layered history. From West Virginia, American blacks, to Jamaica, to Cuba, to los Estados Unidos. It's layered, right? I'm third generation. And it was so important to me to tap in, right? To give back, to serve a community because it connects us, right? And I think so much of our world is beginning to look like that. But there are things that people could do to include people like me. When I looked at the however many most beautiful people in the portada on the front of the magazine, I said, now hold on. You got people from every part of Latin America, not one black person. How are you going to have people on the cover from Cuba, Dominican Republic, Colombia, Panama, and there's not even one? And you're saying the 25 most beautiful people, come on, like, we're in those rooms, we can say do better. When we remake a movie that's supposed to be about a Cuban-American family, we should probably see some black people. I mean, there are discrete things, I think, when we go back, instead of just enjoying these conversations, when we're in the room and we have a chance to invite people in, what does that look like? What do you think the call to action is for the people in this room?
I'll start. Well, I think the immediate call to action is, I have 3. I'm not going to follow the rule. 3 call to actions. First of all, before you leave today, I hope that you tell someone in this room what you need and how they can help you. That's 1. 2, keep pushing. We all have to keep pushing. And 3, one of the things that I admire so much about Julissa, because I followed her on social before we ever met each other, and one of the things I admire and love so much is that when something is wrong, she says it's wrong, she is loud about it, and then I retweet it, right? And so we have to do that. So it's like, we need to be loud, but when other people are being loud, we need to support them in that. And and I think we can't just let people hanging out there by themselves. When we agree with it too, like, we need to show up in that way as well. So those are my 3.
So speaking of having more than one, I have 2. I think the first one, in this space, we've often spoken about external, like, allyship. And I just want to pose the offering to how are we being allies and supportive to one another, particularly because of the fact that, we, again, all of us sit in different levels of privilege. And so when it comes to how we can support one another, how we can be loud about, certain things in support of someone who may not be in the same rooms as us, how are we doing that? So as you leave, that is something to definitely think about. Also have to shout out, Black Latin Americans, Black Latinos, and really say, continue to take up space. I think, as I said earlier, I think the conversation is more visible, but there's going to be spaces where they're not as inclusive, and we still are very deserving to be in those spaces. So do not be afraid to take up space, to say what you need to say, whether publicly or take someone to the side, do what you got to do, and do that unapologetically.
I'm trying to take the jumble in my mind and take words that I can say to you. So I think, a couple of things. One is I really invite all of you to learn about our history. Like, to truly spend some time reading some history books about our people in this country, because you will be enraged by some of the things that have happened to us, but you will also be incredibly inspired. There is a story about these women in Crystal City, Texas, and really they were kids, they were 15, 17-year-old kids who fought against a rule in their school that said only one of the 4 cheerleaders could be Mexican American in a school that was 85% Mexican American. Because in Texas, who held the pom-poms mattered, and it was a signal about who had the power. Right? And these young girls created incredible change in their communities. They not only overturned that racist rule, within 2 years, the school board and the city council was majority Latino. I mean, when I learned about this story, I was like, wow, like had I known, had I had the gift of this story my entire life, how might I be different? And I am different because I know that story. And not only have I told that story, in many different forums, I am working out to tell that story as a limited series with a very incredible writer who I can't say yet. But, it's like learning our history, I think, will really motivate. It has certainly motivated me so much that we need to learn it. So that would be one. And the other one is to take risks. To take risks in your own life, in your own career, because nothing is going to change until it changes, right? And sometimes I have taken a lot of personal risks to call things out. It had cost me money and opportunities to call things out. But I am okay with that. I am okay with being on my own path, in my own journey, at my own pace, not necessarily going as fast as I could go if I made certain compromises. Right? I don't, of course everybody has to compromise and we all have to compromise in some ways, but there's just certain compromises that I'm no longer willing to make. And it's okay if that means that, I'm going a little slower than what I would like to be. And so I think taking those risks, it will pay off eventually, and it'll help to truly change things.
I love that. I also love something Janelle said about, being allies to each other in this space. I also think it's really important to use conversations like this to think about how we can be allies to others. How are we making it easier for our gay, lesbian, bisexual brothers and sisters to be in this space? How are we making, women who are Muslim women who are fleeing Afghanistan, right? Like, how are we using the lessons we learn? I always talk about the best thing I got from my blackness is my empathy. I understand what it feels like if you are a Montagnard fleeing Vietnam, if you are a young girl fleeing Afghanistan, if you are Ukrainian fleeing we get it. Like, we know what that's like to fight for visibility. What I get from my Latinidad is connection, right? Like, how we connect through such a diverse, generational, global diaspora of people, that's a superpower. That connection de corazón, right, is really a superpower. But how do we use that to create space for other people in their own fight, who are dealing with the same things we're all dealing with, right? Questions from the audience. Jump in. And you can just shout. It's a small room. There may be a mic. We talked about it passing out. We have a mic? All right. Do you want to just raise your hand and then the mic can come to you? This gentleman has a mic here to the left, so if anyone just wants to throw their hands up, he can come to you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Anika Thompson with NBC News. Can you talk about the consequences in terms of the next election that's coming up and the election after that, and what activism and success looks like, particularly with a community that is so diverse and so, you're, as you've said, not a monolith, which I hate using that phrase because it's so obvious, but what are the stakes and what are your plans in terms of the election and activating people to vote one way or the other?
I'll just say this. Like, I think we are always so hyper focused on midterm elections, presidential elections at the federal level, right? But we don't spend enough time thinking about our local elections and how that is going to impact us. Because truly, the things that impact our daily lives more than anything else are the laws that are passed at the local level, right? I mean, I'm thinking about Los Angeles, where there is a, Trump-wearing person running as a Democrat now. And I am terrified that this person might win, right? When I look at what's going on with school boards, in San Francisco, the whole school board was ousted because of some of the social justice initiatives. And when we talk about sort of books being banned and textbooks being banned, that starts at the school board. And those are elected positions that we have a say on who's elected. And so my focus has really shifted to let's use the midterms, let's use the presidential elections to really also elevate local elections and to stay engaged throughout the 4 years. Voting is just one way in which you can be civically engaged, but there's so many other ways, and there are elections all the time, constantly happening. That in itself is its own problem and its own issue, that there's so many different dates, because I think it's by design, so that we don't stay engaged. But I think to me, it's sort of using those bigger platforms and those bigger moments to get people to stay engaged throughout the year.
Okay. Sure.
After the election in Alaska this week, there's a party. I'm not going to say which one, because I think we're in a nonprofit space, but one of the parties is not going to stand for that. And we all need to be engaged, and we all need to be bringing the most reluctant person in our families to vote, because if we don't participate, they're going to grab it all.
So a couple of thoughts on this. I come from the farm worker community. Our community has been excluded from the most basic labor protections in the United States for over 80 years. Political leader over political leader after political leader have not done right by our community. And so I just want to make it clear that it's not just this one election, it's all the other elections, and it's all the other elections to come. And everyone needs to be held accountable. And in my work through Justice for Migrant Women, my other organization, I want to see the day when farm worker women are elected to office, because they know best about what they need. And a lot of the work that we're doing on the ground in Ohio, where we're based, we don't call it civic engagement, and we've changed it. We call it civic power, the civic power work that we're doing. It's actually focused on kids, because we need to teach children about their power and all the ways that they can show their power, and it's not just voting. And from what we've experienced where we're doing our work, if I can get an activity book or a coloring book that has information about voting and volunteering and trying to seek an appointment or running for office into the hands of a 4th grader or a 5th grader who then takes that information home and shares it, to me, that's part of building a stronger political future in democracy. And so that's the work we're going to be doing lots of different work, but for us it's really important to focus there. In the county where I live, in the primaries that just happened, we have 30,000 people there and only 1,000 people voted. So we live in an information desert. We live in a civic desert. So where I'm from, my context is we just have to make sure that we get the most basic information into people's hands so that we can then figure out where to go from there. So that's where we'll be focusing.
Do you have more questions? Oh, the question back, yes.
Yeah. I think it's important that how we continue to lift the cross-section of who we are on a continuum, as opposed to just sort of thinking of one event, right, is critical, and that's what you've been focusing on. Because I think that one of the things that happens is that the press segmentalizes discussions, right? And we tend to sectionalize how we view things, right? We can't do that any longer. The question becomes, in my opinion, right, what do we look like under fascism? Democracy hasn't done the best job, but that's the best we know. Most of us come from countries that have dictatorships, right? And the question becomes, the ultimate question becomes, what do we look like under fascism? Because we don't need to argue with a tia and a tío. That's the question in my mind, right? How do we look in a system that hasn't provided resources for our people in our countries? And you came here, and we came here looking for something better, right? And the better, many of us have been able to acquire better. Not all of us, and we need to do the continuous work. But we need to pose the question, and I don't hear it being posed clearly. What do we look like under fascism as people of color?
Yes, in the front.
As we talk about political activism and being engaged and using our power, I really want to invite people to also consider one other job, and that's the job as an election official. I've done that work since I was in my early 20s. And in my early 20s in Denver, working in election, I was working with older white folks who are most of the folks who are working elections. And now they live in Virginia, and I've worked a number of elections there. It continues to be the same, with a little bit more color and a little bit more diversity. Election officials are absolutely gatekeepers of the current rules of who is allowed to participate in our democracy. And when more folks look like us, as you walk through the gauntlet of the various political parties and people who are electioneering outside of our polling places, you provide a sense of ease for people who want to. After you, Rosemary says you've convinced them to actually vote, to come through that door and have someone question your citizenship, your, whether or not you're allowed to be there, can just be devastating. And I think we see more and more of that, as Julissa has talked about local school board elections and everything that is happening in terms of, those spaces. Election work is long and tedious, and you're there for the full day. But it is so important that more of us show up in that space. So it's a little late for this November, but again, if you have a day that you can give up to be an election official, every county in the country, every city in the country trains their election judges and officials. Please consider doing that, especially if you've done GeoTV for days. The best way to figure out how your candidate's doing is to be a nonpartisan election official sitting there watching people walk through the door. So thank you.
Great. Yes, in the back.
Hi, my name is Fatoumata Keita, but I go by Fatu for ease. I was born and raised in West Africa. Have been in New York, Bronx, New York. And I guess my question, it was so beautiful to see the table and also this conversation, because it makes me think about being born and raised in Guinea, West Africa, right? A continent, not a country, as many think, right? And being colonized by so many different European countries, it even makes it even impossible to create that unity, even on the language like Spanish, because we don't have that, right? You have countries that speak French, English, and others. So I wonder, through the connections and the friendships and the sisterhood you've created, what are some of the things that, even though it might seem impossible to create that connection at that table, how did you work to bring sort of unity among you to have these conversations that can be applied to someone like my community?
Truthfully, I'm still thinking through, your question. I think, and I know this sounds extremely basic, but I will say even just starting, right? Because I think sometimes we don't have all the answers. We may not even understand, thinking about the third step from the first step. And I know that there's a lot that is going to have to come with even starting that conversation, but I think just approaching it from the fact that like, okay, I want to maybe start a collective of different people and starting that conversation and allowing other people to support you in it, right? Like you may have this idea, but there's other people who likely have the same idea, and allowing them to support you in that and enrolling them in your idea so that this is a larger thing that's not solely on your shoulders.
So, I hate like watching myself on camera, but I happened to like walk in the moment I was saying the thing about Cubans, and I was like, oh God, I forgot I said that. And I remember, Gloria Estefan, who was Cuban, like she kind of had this look, right? And I think what it reminded me of, and like we talked after, and actually she was like, I kind of told her more about my perspective and like why it is that like that sometimes I feel that way. And I think all of us are protective of like our own communities, right? So there are times when people say things about Mexicans, like Mexicans are racist, or like everything about Latinos always centers around Mexicans. And I used to get very defensive about it because it would hurt me because it's my community. I want to be protective of it because I love it. But I think one thing that has really helped me to build that sisterhood that you're asking about, and to build that community, is to ask myself, what is true about what someone is saying? Right? What is true? There are some things that are not true, but what is true? And I think coming with that kind of like open heart to really question, right, what is true about what this person is saying, without sort of that ego, without sort of that defense mechanism, trying to put that aside and trying to look at something from their perspective. Right? And I think that the more I have done that, the stronger community I have been able to build, and the more that I have been able to do things together with people that I might not fully agree. And I think that's the other thing. I think we have to recognize that we're not going to agree 100% on every single thing, and that doesn't mean that we can't be best of friends, and that doesn't mean that we can't work together for sort of the collective, right, for the community, that we should be able to come together even when we don't agree on every single thing.
Well, in the spirit of perspective and empathy, I would like to thank our panelists for their insight. Let's give them a big round of applause. And thank you to the audience for your wonderful, thoughtful questions and contributions. And I hope you enjoyed the other panels. Gracias.